God. We're waiting for it to start still.
Oh, do you need anything?
Nope, I don't think so. I'm good. Thanks though.
Hey, it looks like we are all here. Welcome back, everyone. I want to just say welcome to everyone to today's panel discussion on the fascinating intersection of AI and art. We have distinguished panel experts here with us today, and we'll be exploring various aspects of this intriguing field. We're so happy that you are all here with us. I'm Christina Woods. I'm the Executive Director of the Duluth Art Institute. I am coming to you from Misabikong, which is the Anishinaabe Moren name for Duluth, and I'm in Minnesota. I'd like to also recognize my colleagues here today, Caitlin Kaler and Aurora Webster, who are helping out on the tech side, and I will be moderating today's discussion. So before we begin, I would like to quickly thank our generous sponsors who are helping fund this opportunity so we can help bring to you on the forefront of this conversation, artists, educators, people who are in the business of art, to have a robust discussion about the impact of AI, the opportunities, the challenges. And Aurora, if you'll go ahead and put those sponsors up on the screen, that would be great. So thank you to UMD, the University of Minnesota Duluth. Thank you to Downtown Computer and Rogue Robot, and all of these sponsors are right here in Duluth, Minnesota. So thank you to them. So let's set the stage with brief introductions of our panelists. I'm going to start with Kathy McTavish. Kathy is a visual artist. She is a composer, and not just a composer of music, but a composer of art. She's working with data and text and code and sound and creating abstract layered images and large scale, small scale. Kathy has her fingers in technology thoroughly. So Kathy, would you say a few things about yourself and why you're here? You're on mute.
Oh boy.
You're still on mute, Kathy. There we go.
I work with technology. So I just wanted to say thanks to the Duluth Art Institute for putting this together. And so my name is Kathy McTavish, and I do, as you said, I'm a composer and transmedia artist, and I live in northern Minnesota, and I work with code. I work with, but I don't work a lot with AI, but I have a lot of thoughts about AI. So I'm so glad to be part of the conversation with the rest of you today.
Thank you, Kathy. We also have Alexis Elder, who is an associate professor of philosophy at the University of Minnesota Duluth. Her main focus is technology ethics. Alexis, tell us more and why you're here.
Yes, and I want to echo Kathy's thanks for including me and putting this panel together. I'm really excited for the discussion tonight. So my main area of research is on technology ethics, and I also teach that a fair amount, especially sort of practical ethics to engineering majors and technologists, students at the University of Minnesota Duluth. My sort of interests in tech come in, I think, in two ways here. I'm really interested in how technology mediates human relationships. And so to me, that involves both what is creativity and what kinds of structures can help foster creativity between people. That includes things like intellectual property practices or legal structures or institutions, as well as how we collaborate with AI sort of as a co-creator of art. So those are kind of my two main interests I bring to the table tonight.
Great, thank you. We also have with us today, Rick Kollath. Did I say that right, Rick?
So that's very right.
Great, thank you. I forgot to ask you that.
It's a weird last name.
Rick is a graphic designer and an illustrator and has his own business here in Duluth doing both of those things. And so Rick, tell us a little bit more about yourself and what brings you to this topic.
Well, I sort of joke with people. It's not really a joke, but I say, well, I drop pictures for a living. And I'd say there's a distinction in my mind. There's a distinction between being an artist and being an illustrator. And even Norman Rockwell saw this distinction. He said what he said. I got this quote. He said, "I'm not a fine arts man. I'm just an illustrator." So this is very interesting. This AI stuff is very interesting for me, and I think it concerns me possibly more than it should concern an artist, like say somebody who's like painting and maybe they put their paintings up in a gallery or whatnot. But for me, I played with AI just a little bit, and it can do in a handful of seconds what it would take me a day and a half to do sometimes. So that's sort of horrific. So in the future, if it's not very good yet as far as the kinds of images that I can create. In any sort of cartoonish, vague, sloppy way, yeah, they're fine. But I think for sort of like higher, finer illustration, not yet, but not yet. And that's going to change. And I suspect that AI is going to be just doing beautiful, wonderful stuff. And how will that affect me? Yeah, not very well, possibly. So I'm concerned.
Well, we're going to be spending some time on that as well. So thank you, Rick. And we have also Ben Moren with us, and he is a media arts web multimedia instructor at the Minneapolis College of Art and Design, which we also know as MCAD. And so, Ben, thank you very much for joining us today. Tell us a little bit more about yourself and why you're here.
Yeah, thanks so much for having me. Yeah, like you said, I'm a professor at MCAD, and I've been both steeped in utilizing AI technology, both in my own personal practice and also teaching some of these things at school. One of the things that I have been working on recently is a large AI project centered around the Lost 40 forest in northwestern Minnesota, where I've been training my own model based on photographs that I took there. So it's a little different than typing in a prompt and generating images and just seeing them kind of magically appear before your eyes, but kind of taking a few steps back and training things. So I have some understanding of the kind of technical ins and outs of what these systems look like, and use them. And I definitely have lots of opinions about the large language models and other models that have been based on open source, or not necessarily open source, but public data. So yeah, looking forward to the conversation. Thanks so much for having me. Yes.
And we also have Jonathan Thunder, who is a visual artist. He lives here, if I can say, in Missabi-Kong, which is, I think, everyone but Ben maybe is up here in Duluth. And Jonathan approaches the world with both a personal lens, but also a social commentary in his art, and has used technology to create some works. And so, Jonathan, do you want to tell us more about yourself and what interest you have in AI art?
Yeah, thanks, Christina. Good to see everybody here on the panel. I work as a visual artist. I went to school for painting, and I also went to school for visual effects and animation, which has been sort of like a merger for the backbone of my artist career. Over the years, I've worked with technology. I've also always thought of myself more in the fine art sense. So it's always been, I guess, in my best interest, and something that I'm honestly interested in is to stay up to date with what technological advancements are coming out in the creative industry. So I've definitely stayed up, on this, maybe not as much as some, but just smart enough to sort of keep my ear to the ground and see, what's out there. So when I got invited to this conversation, I figured if anything, I would learn something. I haven't seen AI quite push its nose into my world, but I've witnessed the multiple uses for it. And some of it I like, some of it I could live without. So, I guess somewhere in there I might have something to say.
Well, we're happy you're here. So we're going to kick this off with thinking about how AI challenges our set assumptions about how things work. It's not going away, and it's weird in some ways. It's kind of weird. And so I want to start the conversation off with how you all see AI shaping the art landscape today, in the future. What opportunities, if you want to talk about opportunities or challenges, you decide which way you want to go. But with where we're at and the challenge to what we have always known, where are we going with this?
Well, somebody should jump in, so I guess that's just me. Well, it's going to become more and more common, of course. I think there's sort of good sides to this, and there are some bad sides to this. Here's a good side, perhaps. Think of a little kid a 7-year-old or an 8-year-old who wants to make it an image or a picture, who can sort of tell his phone, her phone, their device to just by telling him, I want it to be this with this feature and that feature and in this style, and they get this picture. And that's sort of, that for them will be very rewarding and sort of fun. If you want an image of something for some use or other, you can just do that yourself. You don't have to buy it from anyone else. You can just have AI make it for you for almost nothing. It certainly is quick and speedy. I think if you're in business, for example, and you need images that aren't photographs, illustrations, let's just say, I think it's going to be very handy at some point that you're going to just be able to make your own images. And that will be for small businesses, for example, very much of a cost savings and also fast. And that's always a handy thing in business. So in the business world, and I think even in this private world with families and whatever, I think it has the chance to make a kind of a positive difference. There's another side to it. And it's for people like me, who it's not necessarily going to improve my life necessarily, in that down the road, being an illustrator, I think will be a little bit trickier to pull that off. That's about it.
Alexis.
Sure. So I think for me, and this is my ethicist background coming in, it's not just a question of how will AI shape the art landscape. I don't have a crystal ball. Also important proviso for what I'm about to say. I don't have a law degree. But I do think we get some say in what things are going to look like individually and collectively. And I'm very interested in that question of what do we want society to look like? Our current set of copyright laws have certainly been, I think, I'm happy to say, imperfect, but they are an attempt to try to formalize and facilitate various kinds of creative communities. And this is something to some extent new, but also a little bit old. And looking at people sort of responding to the rise of generative art is, I think, pushing us to ask, how do we want to shape the art landscape? So maybe to comment to two specific examples. One, there's been a lot of discussion about the incorporation of copyrighted images into AI training sets. And under current legal practices, that counts as transformative use, right? We've often thought that it's very important in creative communities to be able to sort of take in inspiration and remix it and reframe it, and not try to sort of commit ourselves to the idea that for art to count as genuinely creative, it needs to just, spring forth out of nothing, but can reflect these kind of communities and processes. So I think we need to have some real conversations and introspection about that. And also what kind of comes out at the moment. I think the courts are trying to take a step back and wait to see how things unfold a little bit more. So at the moment, my sense on the US legal system is AI art is not copyrightable. But maybe if it becomes a more kind of common collaborative tool or element of human creative processes, artists may wish to weigh in more on sort of their part in the creation, and that might be something that we might want to shift. So those for me are just kind of questions, like how do we think about what gets taken up and how do we think about what comes out, and not treat it as inevitable, but have conversations about where we want this to move.
Yeah, just to piggyback off that for just a second, I think one interesting thing that will probably come up in the near future, a lot of these, or maybe not a lot, but definitely a good amount of companies are asking for regulation around, ethical use and just all these questions that we have about source material and output and all of these things. And so, it's a stone's throw away before you're going to see this on the ballot, which will be an interesting thing, in terms of casting a vote or seeing this come up in, legislature discussions, that sort of thing. I imagine that it will be particularly tied to jobs. But, there'll be very interesting use cases, I think, around, like impersonation, defamation, these kinds of other, not so obvious spaces where this will start to creep in as well. And copyright, of course, will be a big one.
Yeah.
I think for me, at this moment is fairly pivotal because we're using the word AI, which is a really general term, but the thing that we keep reading about are like ChatGPT, which is a large language model. And the way those are constructed, it's kind of a black box, and they're put to work on hundreds of billions of data points of text. They're just eating up text and images, New York Times, just everything. And it's very select, so it's huge and it's incredibly energy. It consumes lots of water, it consumes lots of energy. I mean, so it's a carbon emission bomb, but it's still, as much data as it uses, it's still, that data is skewed, right? So I think it's this moment where we need to ask ourselves, and I think like the Manhattan Project, the atom bomb, like that's this other moment when we need to ask ourselves, like technology, it's not just progress, right? Technology isn't something that it's just us being clever and it always goes in a good direction. Like Alexis says, we get to decide. And I think that as an artist, I feel like we have this role to play about just kind of really doubling down about, like, so Rick might use pen and ink, but why? He could use, he can use Photoshop and a digital printer, but why does he do that? Like, why does someone choose to use a cello? Why does someone choose to use a printmaking device? Why does someone paint? I feel like it's this moment where we can double down and say who we are as humans and who we are as creators, and say we have the right to choose our tools, and we have the right to, because these things are really rapidly being used to affect our credit scores, affect our ability to get housing, they're huge. Like I've heard large language models being just described as stochastic parrots, or super powered autocorrect. I mean, they're not magic. They don't know things, but they use the data that is skewed, is biased, in order to reflect that back to us in a very efficient manner. So there's sort of a mirror of all of those historic injustices that are baked in. And I think we have the right as humans to address that mirror and say, so are we just going to let this move on and actually hyper speed our process to this averaging of, becoming, sort of the US centric white male speaking English, capitalist. Like, so we have the right to say, is this the direction? Is this the road we want to get on? And to be critical, like we all can be critical about asking questions. We don't just have to jump on the bus and go. And so I think it's this moment where we can grab our tools and say, this is who I am. These are the tools I use, and I choose to use them.
Oh.
Is that me? I
Hop in.
like what you're saying there, Kathy. That's an interesting thought, and I think it across the multiple uses of AI, it seems like there's the question of, like, because we can, does that mean we should? Like the writing of a school paper, the ability to write a school paper by saying, hey, like, write me a paper on the life of Salvador Dali or something like that, or the manifesto of the surrealists and why that came to be. So that child or that student, whoever uses that, like, they gain nothing, as along with the idea of probably a lot of this stuff, where, like, unless you're doing like what Ben does, where you're kind of training your own AI. It's sort of it seems like the smarter our equipment gets, the less smart we become. So I do like that they're getting ahead of this stuff. Like, a buddy of mine's a school teacher here in Duluth, and he says that they're talking about having kids write with a program that will record their writing, so that they can go back and actually see that the kid wrote the paper. And that way you don't graduate a bunch of kids that don't know anything, except for how to write prompts. So I think a big part of the conversation here is, the ethical standpoint of AI, because I can think of some uses for it. It could be amazing, like to teach endangered languages or something like that. And I can think of some really scary, like purposes for AI, and science fiction tends to write the future. you know, for anybody who's made a phone call on their watch, I guess if you watch any, you know, like sci-fi about what happens when our tech gets smarter than us, you know, I'm not saying, you know, like AI driven tanks are going to come down the street in 10 years from now, but I don't know, you know, I'm just a guy who makes stuff for a living.
There's definitely a lot of sci-fi out there that can create some fear. And, you know, Jonathan, I just want to build off of something that you were speaking to with regards to just students learning to write. There was a podcast I was listening to, Ezra Klein, I believe, and they were talking about how schools are moving into understanding that AI is not going to go away, but looking at how to use it as a tool. And so when a student writes using ChatGPT, they can turn that in, but they have to turn in a handwritten draft, an outline, and they have to turn in a printed document where they go through that ChatGPT write-up and check data, put footnotes, like look for the facts, and then they turn it in as a whole packet. And so it's in that way, I feel like there can be some benefit to it. And in the context of art, can we talk a little bit about, I mean, it won't replace actual painting or hopefully photography, but what can AI do in the context of creating art? And can we kind of talk a little bit about sort of the humanist side of art? What's missing from AI generated art that exists in something created by what we define today as humans?
Well, certainly there's this one aspect of art which I think most folks appreciate. If you walk up to a painting and you can actually see sort of the paint on it and make out where there's like it's thicker and it's thinner, and sometimes this color is coming through from underneath, and it's handmade. And I think people very much appreciate something that's handmade and built by a person in a way. And you're not gonna get that with AI. I mean, the closest, well, I mean, pretty tricky to pull that off with AI. Mostly you're gonna have to print something. There's a way with some printers could add some sort of texture, but I don't think it would look quite the same, at least not yet. Maybe in 10 years, who knows? But I think this idea that is, and I'm really thinking here about going out and buying art. If you're the consumer going out to buy art, there is something about this person who made this thing. And I think if they understood that this was made by AI, it would not have that character. And I think people often would miss that. Will they miss that forever? We don't know. But certainly in the current situation, I think people who are interested in collecting art, for example, I don't think AI has quite as much draw on those folks.
So I think about, Kathy, your work, and part of your work is hand coding. Maybe you could talk about that a little bit in the context of, you know, can AI be handmade?
Well, I think Ben is an example of someone who's using some of those strategies to, it's almost like, you know, like Rick, like what you're saying, it's this thing that artists have talked about for a really long time, right? Is that if you just push a button on a large language model that's been handed to you from some Uber corporation, so you can, then there's this opaqueness to that process. And I think for a long time, right, artists have talked about the importance of process, right, which is why we pick our tools, why we pick the materials that we pick, why we pick the amount of time. Like printmaking takes so much time, right? But some people, it's the time, that's a material for us, right? And so I feel like I guess for me, like it's in terms of grabbing tools, grabbing materials, it's also grabbing how much of our human, that resource of time and body that we put into work. And so for me, like the reason why I choose to do hand coding, it's like I'm writing text that then in a sense performs itself. It's this very transparent process, right? Humans can read the text that I'm using in order to produce a frame. And then if I'm making a film, it's frame, 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 frame. That's the thing that's so beautiful about things like film, like old school film, right? It's like you can actually see the magic and how that materially is being, how time is being manifested. And I feel like there's something about choosing opaque tools versus choosing, I guess, transparency. And that's what I feel like about Ben's work. He's actually using these tools, but he's using them. It's really exhausting to actually train a model. He's actually doing this commitment, the sacrifice. It's like a ritual sacrifice of time and creative thought. And so I don't know.
Well, Ben, hop on in here.
Yeah, I'm happy to add to that. So we want to just to kind of feed into that exact thread of thought. I've been thinking about the kind of distinction that people make around this kind of like what counts as an art thing or a non-art thing, right? Which I think is like this is a slippery discussion, and we don't need to go there. But I think a lot of people kind of put intention, process, like Kathy was saying, and I would add my own third maybe marker, which is a level of deep observation. I think that's kind of inherent inside of artwork generally, and not necessarily that it means that all artwork is observational in sort of representational, but that there's a level of observation that's inherent in the practice of making the thing. And whether that's being extremely observational as you're making an abstract work or what have you, that is kind of an inherent characteristic. And I think that those things, like Kathy said, are kind of removed from the process in a way, or they're at least obscured in a way to the if you're typing in a prompt and kind of generating that thing. The interesting thing is I think that you can, with different AI systems, get that back, and in different ways. With what I've been working on over the last couple of years, I've been training. I trained a model, so I took thousands and thousands of photographs of the Lost 40 forest, and then trained a model based on that. And so I can synthesize images of trees that are, an infinite amount of them essentially. And originally that was as a gesture to kind of look at what the old growth forest looked like and to try to think about what it would look like to regrow the trees, through this kind of futile gesture. But I also think there's other ways of engaging with observation, with time, with process, with intention, with inside of these AI systems. I can imagine, and I know that there are artists working in this way already that are, generating banks of images and then using that as source material and reprocessing that and working through that in different ways. And, that is a different way of kind of approaching that from a materials standpoint, rather than from a kind of like, I hit the button and it's done approach. Not unlike somebody who might be doing collage with a magazine of photographs or something like that. And all sorts of myriad of other ways that you might engage with the kind of materiality of those images or text or sound or other synthesized generated pieces of material that come out of these systems.
I think Martin DeWitt is here, and we recently had a body of his work at the Duluth Art Institute where, Ben, you were talking about the saving of images and using images over and over and over again in different ways was really the embodiment of that exhibition that Martin put together. So you're right, artists are integrating so much technology and information into this creation of art, and doing it, I feel, in a way that's really amplifying the humanity that exists in being able to tell a story or say something through some kind of commentary through art.
So last semester, I was teaching a tech ethics class, just as kind of Mid-Journey was getting big, and we'd read a piece about whether AI art is art, and especially prompt engineering as a form of creative expression. And I decided to do a live demo in class, so I'm not very good at this, and I just typed in orange hamster and I think some style parameters, and it drew an orange, the fruit, with a hamster face. Because just thinking of like things people can do that AI can't, was learn from context what kind of orange I was talking about. I just meant the color, but it was delightful and like very instructive in the moment. But I keep thinking about these AI art generators that are really bad at drawing hands or human faces, right? And we tend to think, oh, those are just like small limitations, we'll overcome those. But those are features of this particular sort of neural network, right? They're not doing modular learning. There's no sort of connecting ideas together at any deeper level. It's just pattern recognition. And if most pictures of hands are, from the side or, not sort of perfect representations, it's never going to get that. And I still worry. And I think I started worrying about this a while ago, but like Rick's discussion has really kind of made it evident. It can be really bad at the basics, and we still should worry, because one of the things we know about our society is artists are frequently devalued. And so it's not necessarily like, oh, if we can just show all the things that humans can do that AI can't, we're safe. We're already in a moment where lots of companies are trying to outsource stuff to bots that we know are performing substandardly, just as a reflection of how labor and time and skill and craft are devalued. So not to be too much of a downer, but like, I think these play into much larger conversations about how art fits into society, but also to put in a plug for, it's hard to write a good prompt. My colleague Glenn Trujillo has pointed out there's actually these days professional marketplaces for prompt writing, because a lot of business owners were like, I'll just get an AI to make a picture for me and save on artistry, discover really quickly how hard it is to make the machine do what you want. And so we're getting this new layer of craft and skill, because it turns out, and even people who work with human artists know, like, clients are terrible at describing what they want.
So I do want to ask a question about valuing artists and their art, but I want to make sure Jonathan isn't waiting to hop in on this topic.
I guess I'll just respond to a couple things I heard. And it's interesting, Alexis, that you talk about the hand as one of the flaws in AI art imagery, because as a student of drawing, I've always thought that if you're going to draw hands, draw them well, or don't draw them well at all. It's just like, don't try to get perfection if you can't do it, otherwise just don't show that one. But that's just, that has nothing to do with professionalism. That's just like opinion stuff. And I also wanted to touch base on what I've learned in my professional art career as somebody who pays my espresso bills and light bills with my artwork. I remember learning about CG and learning that there were certain things in CG programs that you could push a button and make perfect car, or like, boom, there's a plant with all the little leaves on it and stuff like that. And none of this stuff came in handy when working with clients who said, hey, can you make me something, for this? Because I like that one piece that you did, like the human hand is what they connected to, right? And those are just my clients. Of course, there are like corporate clients or small business clients that were mentioned who can only afford clip art, or something like that on their clip art budget. Maybe they'll buy some AI art or something like that. But those aren't the people that have supported me in my life. The people that I respond to, much like the people in this panel, are the people who are an active part of the art community in some form or fashion, whether that be writing, graphic design, illustration, photography. active. I think the people who are using this paper thin stuff to create shoestring budget artwork, I don't live in their world. You know what I mean? So I haven't given them much thought other than getting to the point where I realize that I don't have to think about them much. You know, that's how much I think I've sort of looked into this. I am interested in it. I haven't had time to use AI imagery yet. And Alexis, I will say that the one time I remember visiting with a buddy and he was just like, oh man, you got to try Dolly 2. And I was like, oh, that sounds cool. So I went home and I remember being like, you know, a guy with a yellow suit standing in red liquid next to a short school bus or something like that. And it was terrible. You know, I remember, like a photorealistic guy doing the same thing, and it was still terrible. And then I realized that there's like this entire learning curve that these guys have to do in order to get where they're, you know, like actually making something that's kind of easy on the eyes, so to speak. So, I mean, if they want to invest time in that, time's money, you know, so hopefully they get paid to do it. But yeah, just some thoughts that came up when listening to, you know, what you guys are talking about. And I also wanted to say, I've been to that Lost 40 forest, you know, trekking around in that area sounds like way cooler than somebody who copied and pasted a prompt. So kudos to you, man.
Thanks, Jonathan. I could go in 3 different directions right now. We have a question in our chat about valuing artists and their art. Another thought I have is, like, what do you think the message about the medium coming through AI is giving us? So is it like output matters, or life is easier and quicker? I mean, we can go into that. And then I have just this whole big thought about, you know, AI in and of itself as a function in society, and maybe a function as a colonizer. So I am interested first in putting out this question from Anya Hogan. Could AI art just increase the value of human handmade art intrinsically and commercially? And Jonathan, you kind of talked about this a little bit. Rick, you touched on this a little bit. Ben, your project touches on this as well. And kind of what I'm hearing is there's still a learning curve, and we may shorten that learning curve in some ways in the future. But really, is that learning curve ever going to go away, where already, if we're devaluing art that is handmade or not valuing it enough, is this going to have an impact at all? What are your thoughts on that?
Well, there's a weird sort of philosophical question you can put out there to show what you're doing. And the question is, what is the purpose of art in human life? That's, you know, where do you go with that? But I mean, there is something to be said for that, because if it's just to like get an image across that teaches you something or explains something or is fun to look at or makes you laugh, I mean, I think those are functions that art does. But my sense is there's a greater function above that, and some of you have already touched on this idea that the process, the time, the energy, this sort of creative thing, this mulling over and transforming your idea into this visual thing. I'm not sure that AI is going to pull that off very, very soon. And I think that there's always going to be, at least for many people, some people, an appreciation of that which AI does not quite satisfy. Now, maybe AI is going to get so damn good in the future that we won't be able to tell the difference. But I mean, certainly in terms of everything that's handmade, AI cannot compare to that. Actually, I think. But is that helpful? I don't know. It's out there. What's hard for?
I think that goes back to the story of an artist. You know, I remember being in art history, and Doug Garter, my art history teacher, kind of turning the lights off and going through these slides. And whenever you tell the story of somebody, I was so much more interested in their artwork. And I think that's, you know, that's the difference maybe with probably what we're talking about are these really crisp, you know, like super weird hands images of like the elderly couple with like the cool suits. I'm sure everybody's seen that one. That's a very specific image, you know, and when you talk to an artist who you believe in, you know, like Rick, I've seen your work. I didn't know that I'd seen your work, but it turns out I have seen it. Very cool, very singular, you know, it's your story, you know, and I think AI artists will have their story. I know one AI artist who's using it to sort of lead the land back theme in his work by creating books and stuff like that. I think he's kind of feeding images from his tribe into, you know, his whatever engine he's using, if that's the word to use. But and then pumping out, you know, some cool stuff. And I remember at first kind of like being like, man, you know, like making art with AI sort of looks like, you know, you're sitting at a one-armed bandit at the casino and being like, make me some art. And then, you know, the wheels spin and then you just get what you get. So, yeah, I don't know. I don't know. The human story to me is king. The human story to me is the spirit of art. And AI art is art, you know, in my opinion, I will say, because when photography came along, right, everybody was going crazy. And when NFTs came out, you know, people were like, this is the end of the art world. And, you know, it's just another facet. It's just another way to sell art. But, you know, I think, you know, the human spirit, that's where it's at. That's just my opinion.
I'm curious.
Go ahead, Ben.
I was just going to say, I'm curious about the word value in that statement. I think that's like a, you know, very open-ended kind of word, because we could be talking about lots of different kinds of value, right? Like if we think that handmade artwork will monetarily be more expensive, you know, or people will pay more money for it or something because it's a kind of a hand cultivated object. I don't necessarily know that that feels like it would be different to me looking into the future. I think we've gone through some kind of iterations of that type of, you know, like with the democratization of graphic design software, for example, we've already kind of gone through some kind of wheels turning of that kind of a thing with photography, like Jonathan was saying. But the value of, you know, supporting somebody or the value of like looking at those kind of moments of observation, those moments of time, like maybe, I don't know, I think that's like that's a larger kind of societal question. I was thinking about when when that first popped into my head, I was thinking about, you know, some experiences like, you know, we had Northern Spark Festival here in Minneapolis, or we had, you know, there's now like Meow Wolf and these kind of like immersive experiential art practices, and that are just wildly popular and successful. You know, in some ways, maybe more so than going to a museum and kind of walking around and looking at paintings. And I think that that's in direct response to the kind of like maybe not over, but just mass kind of digitization of our time, you know, to have that kind of on the ground tactile experience. And, you know, something like Meow Wolf is totally supported by all sorts of, you know, digital processes and projection and light and sound and, you know, all sorts of things, but it's about creating this immersive space. I think that there is something to those kinds of experiences that I think people are potentially starting to value more than maybe they had in the past. You know, a different kind of way of approaching the art space more broadly.
Jonathan brought up kind of an interesting point about photography being introduced in the old days. And it's sort of interesting because until photography was introduced, all painting and illustration was always lifelike, as accurate as possible. You know, being artistic, it's not like how we think of it today. And so photography dramatically changed art, I would say. And you can certainly argue in many good ways, in bad ways, I don't know, but it's certainly in many good ways. And something's going to happen with this AI coming into existence and sort of taking over all this visual creation. And I think art, is going to probably change in reaction to it somehow. And I'm not sure quite how and in what way, but I foresee perhaps that's one way that what we consider art made by people will carry on. Who knows how it's going to change? I have no clue, but I could see a sort of a similar change happening. A lot of experimentation. I mean, think of all the art movements that came into existence shortly after photography came into existence, all kinds of stuff. And so maybe there's going to be all kinds of stuff happening down the road that we can't imagine yet.
I think you're totally right about that. Like when I think about, you know, traditional kind of portraiture painting or, you know, like a Caravaggio or something. And there's arguments of whether those folks were even using like camera obscuras to make those paintings, right? So that could be a precursor even to photography in a sense. And then, yeah, you just have that explosion after that kind of process becomes commodified and more popularized and accessible. And like we're hitting a moment of that. And maybe just a very early one, even, you know, like maybe we're in the like daguerreotype phase of AI. Who knows?
Kathy, you wanted to jump in.
Yeah, you know, I think so. There's this thing that we're talking about aesthetics, right? About whether, you know, whether we say, well, art, you know, by AI is crap, you know, but like we fetishize things that are done by the hand, you know, like a knitting would be better than, and I don't think I'm that interested in those arguments, like what's kitsch, what's art, what's it, you know, I feel like those have been so exhausted. Is photography or really, you know, that always happens with technology and with then becoming, you know, I don't know. So but what I feel like is really important though, is that some of these large language models that we could use, and, you know, I started using ChatGPT too, and I used it like thinking about our prompts. I do believe that you hone how you talk to this object, and there's something really moving about how right away you feel like someone's talking to you back, and it's like Pinocchio, or it's sad. It's like this, I found it very human, very moving, very interesting how you could hone the prompt. And then I started reading more about what goes into training these large language models, who's owning them, what the data sets are. And I just decided I don't want to participate though. So I feel like it's kind of like, I feel like there's something in terms of ethics, though, that these large language models that are owned by very few corporations, it's within this context of data that's skewed. These models, they don't know how they work. They're not accurate. They're firing journalists left and right because they can just have ChatGPT write something and it sounds great. I said, because I don't write that well. I'm like, could you write me like a little bit of an artist statement? And it's like, sure, it did a great job. Our kids could write. So you can say, could you write me an essay? And it sounds like academic talk. And then I just thought, so do we want us to all sound like academic talk? Like, do we want to do that? And I just remembered the old days and kind of punk land and queer culture, street culture. And I just think that there's something about subvert it, like make it ugly, make it like just like I don't want to sound like that. And I want my kid to make the perfect essay and be worried that they copied it? Well, maybe the kid should just do ugly essays. Maybe the goal is just make them do ugly essays, like just to do superhuman. They could do it on chalk on the sidewalk or something. And then did they make it? Yes, they made it. Like, I just feel like they could do zines, they can do tattoos, they can do, I just feel like there's all these ways that do we need to participate in this thing that's burning up the planet? Because to train these models takes so much energy. And I'm not talking about like 10 computers. drive a car, take a flight. No, I'm talking about at a scale that's unprecedented. And then to use them to make a cookbook or do a cute poem, it costs a lot of energy for me as an artist to have this cute relationship with this toy, writing a poem for me about something that's hyper local that I could write for myself. Like, do I need the whole world's data to come into giving me a poem about brownies or about my girlfriend who's in the next room? I say no. So I say that there's something to, it's not just an aesthetic, like what's good, what's bad. Do we have the right to say what's good? No, I think there's just something ethically about the choice to participate, to hold hands and jump in with these huge corporations that they don't care that their model is bad. They don't care that they don't know how those parameters are being fed. They don't care that they're burning down the planet so that they can win, so Google can win over Microsoft. And with the latest data set that I feel like they care about the commercial application of your private data, and they really don't care. Oh, geez, it's not being accurate. And a lot of journalists, no, it's not. That's not the profit motive for them to fix those machines. And yet, these models that are incredibly skewed by the data set, we don't know how they work. They're inaccurate, but they sound like they're accurate. They're making stuff up. They're hallucinating. And yet we treat it just goes out onto these journalistic platforms, or we just play with them as artists. Like, I just feel like I feel like there's a decision to be made there about this particular set of tools and who owns them. And I feel like coming from queer culture, like when the police would raid a gay bar, there was this great thing about humor, right? The drag queens would be like, act like the police are there to pick, they try to pick up the police. It was funny. It was queer humor. That was subversive queer humor. And I feel like I was doing that with some of my projects. Like, well, actually, this is going to be this hyper Z, this queer Z burlesque queen. That's the hive honey AI agent, but I felt, but at the same time, I feel like, so we can subvert, play with, but I feel like actually at the point where we're using it, we are making this decision. And you can say, well, so I do kind of say that, well, I'm going to do really bad machine learning. I'm going to do really all these queer images, take my data. But the truth is, though, if I actually participate, when I was with ChatGPT saying that model could be better if this and that, then I just become sort of this agent of Google trying to fix their commercial model. And so and then now they're like, oh yeah, it's always like you say, like, show me a picture of a professor and it's a white guy. And so they're like, oh yeah, we should add in a little bit of random thing there so that once in a while a Black woman will come up. And so they are trying to do that, spice it up a bit, but they aren't really fundamentally, there's no profit motive to fundamentally examine, have the models talk about how they drew conclusions, what data they're eating in order to draw those conclusions. And I feel like, so I feel like that it's sort of a different question to me than just simply aesthetics.
So Kathy, it goes back to what Alexis brought up earlier about what do we want, right? And where does keeping our critical mindset come in? Because as humans, we do have agency. And what do we want to be agents of? I think that's what you're kind of getting at, Kathy. Like, what do I want to be an agent of? Do I want to be an agent of thinking critically? Do I want to be an agent of treating AI as a toy? Do I want to be an agent of buying into the bias that exists within like ChatGPT right now, or any of the generators of images, because it is based on normed culture and the big language base of English, right? And so I think that agency piece is really important, and the critical mindset piece too comes into play when we're thinking about the intersection of AI in our life. Alexis.
Yeah, and this is really helping me to crystallize some things that were kind of bouncing around my head earlier. So thank you. I think, Kathy, you're saying better than I was thinking. Some stuff that was about the way that I have a lot of faith in artists doing weird, cool stuff that would never have occurred to me, including subverting some of the norms and expectations around AI and AI art. I was talking to a friend a couple months ago about how, like, with photography as our example, like, get a bunch of photography nerds together and they start like seeing what you can do to make the medium visible. So like playing around with lens flare. And I don't doubt that there are going to be really cool things that artists can do even with generative art that's going to not be pretty, but it's going to show off the weird hands or the, misunderstanding prompts. And that seems like that might be really kind of culturally valuable, to have folks who are out there showing, making the system transparent. But at the same time, I'm really reluctant to do PR for the current generative AI systems, which often are very much profit driven in a model that, Christina's already brought in, the sort of colonial framework, which immediately brought to mind this line from data ethics about companies treating data like the new oil. Like it's this resource that's just there to be mined and put to work. And a lot of what seems to be driving the large models, and I think this applies to both visual, but especially obvious with some of the large language models, the idea is to create dependency. If you need such big server farms and so much data processing that your average startup or your average backyard artist can't scrape it together on their own, then we're all beholden to the folks who have the infrastructure to collect and maintain those giant data sets. And so to my mind, what Ben's doing sounds cool. And not just because Ben's, working in is a good artist and like working in this creative way, but also because it is keeping the agency in the hands of the individuals in some ways that maybe, collective action is hard. But if the specific model we're dealing with is one where it is deliberately designed to be at a scale that's going to keep the big tech companies big, because this is a dynamic sector of the market. Like they have interest in locking in a kind of infrastructure that's going to make everyone else dependent on them. Do we want to even play that game?
Even with my project, I essentially was using Amazon Web Services because it's such a labor intensive practice. And yeah, there's a huge climate impact that even comes from doing a small project like this. It's something I've thought a lot about. It's not to say that I couldn't do it on a machine in my house. It would just take a really long time, and so it's about different kinds of questions scale, I guess, is like a really, really interesting question with these things. Another thing, Christina, you were saying agency, and I think that you're thinking about agency from the, our ability to interact with these tools, but I also think a lot about agency from the other side, which Alexis, you brought up in relationship to the data, like something like Reddit, which is a primary source for ChatGPT. I'm pretty sure if I remember right, they just closed, or they just monetized their API, their application programming interface, which is kind of like the back end way of accessing that data. So they're essentially, you're having your conversation in your private chat, be it, on Reddit or maybe Facebook communities or whatever it might be. And then suddenly your conversations are then being turned into data, which is then monetized for Facebook or, Microsoft or whatever it might be in order to, train these large language models or image models, and there's lots of questions, I think, that are going to arise around terms of service of, social media applications and other ways that we engage with the web that are like really things we should be paying attention to. I know that when you see a TOS, it's like, just like a ridiculous litany of text, but there are some places to look at that stuff. Like there's one website, I think it's called TOS TLDR, too long, didn't read. That gives you some kind of like icons of like what you are agreeing to do when you check onto, one of these services. And I think that's another layer of participating in this kind of internet, web, especially social media space as we dive deeper, like, the kind of like quote, I'm not sure who it's attributed to, but if it's free, you're the product. That's like a good thing to kind of think about as you're navigating these spaces, even more so than before. It's not just advertising now. There's a whole other kind of bent to these things at the moment.
So I think about all the intersections of this, you know, how the technology treats our environment, how the technology informs us as we create our social identities, and how we read it, what we read it, all the lenses we use, and whether or not people know there's bias to it or not. And all these things kind of come together in that way. But I kind of wonder on the other side of that, when we talk about, and this is changing the subject, but it made me think of this, accessibility to the arts. Does AI offer accessibility to creating art even that may not be there for some folks?
You know, I just want to say that I think that might be true, but in a similar way, you can think about Facebook, right? So it provided this accessibility, and Alexis has written so much about friendship within the context of Web 2. So it's like, but it's like it created this place where we could organize, we could connect with people we haven't talked to for a long time, connect to people internationally. We could have a physical disability and be able to connect and participate in something, and that we couldn't go to a particular physical location. And so there was like these good things, but then it was within this silo of hyper capitalism, right? So now guess what? Maybe your stuff is locked in there, and actually you can't, like Facebook can't talk to Twitter, right? So there's totally these silos where you're kind of stuck, and you keep producing content for them, and then their algorithms shift so that it prioritizes people that actually pay money to have their stuff seen. So so you sort of buy in and you participate, and in some ways that's like, oh, that's great, but then you lose other things. It's like so it makes it accessible, but you'll lose something else, like posters, like meeting people on the street, like writing letters, like writing emails, like knowing how to write your own website. The beginning of the internet was ugly websites that were text with a few takes. Everyone can do their own website, you know? And because the goal was communication, not just to be the best slick magazine, right? It's like mimeographs. Well, that doesn't look very slick. It was purposeful when people use the tools you have access to and you understand. And so I think that, yeah, there's an accessibility piece, but you know, like, I feel like, are we going to repeat Web 2? You know, that's I think the danger within this hyper capitalistic introduction of some of those tools.
Yeah, that kind of gets back to the thought about what are the potential outcomes. And it'll be different for everyone, right? But could an outcome be, you know, about accessibility, or is the outcome of AI outsourcing your thinking, which is what you're talking about, Kathy? Like, we don't realize that we're actually outsourcing our thinking. That becomes content somewhere. But can AI be a place where somebody can explore creating, or find a way to interact with people through art? It might be an ethics question in there. Yeah, it's kind of a big question when you think about who gets access. And we experience this at the Duluth Art Institute when we offer classes for people who want to learn the creative process, and there's barriers involved. And so what does it mean in relation to opening that up for people? I think I've stumped you. I didn't mean to do that.
Yeah, and in the goal of, I mean, I think that we all want art to be accessible to people, you know, both in term, you know, in all ways, like, but affordability, for example. So let's think about affordability. Well, one way to have a really affordable website is have a Facebook page, right? So, I mean, it's not that I think that that's not true, but the thing is, like, do you really want to get everyone through your venue on-ramped? into these places where it's true, if you aren't paying for it, you are the product. So do you want to sell people into these systems that, because you also have these broader missions of things like anti-racism work, anti-colonial work. So for the cheapness of being able to use ChatGPT on the browser, I don't know, I mean, I think maybe we all together have to really love, I love drawing, seeing all this like VR and blah, blah, blah. I keep coming back to, I just adore drawing. I just keep, I come back to that. And that's, I was walking down the street on my way here and there's kids that done chalk drawings on the street. I feel like there's something about affordability within the context of, do you really want to onboard people to sell them into this other system?
Yeah, I think about accessibility, and not from like acquiring artwork, but from making artwork, right? Like everyone can be an artist. And I think, sure, if the goal is to make like a slick image, maybe it's like an accessible way to achieve that. But in terms of like self-expression, I think it's like it requires a lot of scaffolding to get to that point, and you just don't need it, right? Like, I've got it right here, right? I don't need those things. I've got my voice. I've got all sorts of things that I can use that are much faster and much less in all regards that I can get to self-expression. Mm-hmm. Is it going to be sort of like slick and what like our kind of societal pressure of what image threshold of like acceptable or good or whatever you want to put it is? I don't know. That's a whole other thing. I don't think that has anything to necessarily to do with the work that you're making, but maybe the reflection of the way in which people are looking at it or interpreting it. And that and just on a technical level, we in the United States have a at least in cities, we have a pretty decent internet infrastructure, but that is not the case in a lot of places, including a lot of the more rural United States. So just that alone is like a huge barrier to accessibility that could be met in other ways.
Well, I would have something to say about children, and I don't have any kids, so for me to say anything about kids is kind of ridiculous. But nonetheless, I'm going to try this. I think not everybody can draw. Not everybody's visually oriented. Some people are more literate or literarily oriented or word based. Let's just say I've got a friend. She says when you say fish to her, she thinks FISH. Which what? How can you think that way? But there are visual people, and like everybody here, for example, and we love to make images, and we probably, I'm assuming you folks all started that when you were kids. I'd be amazed if you hadn't, that you didn't like draw pictures when you were kids. God knows I did. And that's this wonderful thing, and it can be a very handy skill from time to time. If you have to just make like a thumbnail sketch to show somebody something, that's, oh man, that's so handy. Well, most people don't probably appreciate that, and most people aren't going to be able to do that. And I'm thinking of little kids growing up, and are you going to teach them to draw? And are they going to be, if they've already seen these AI drawing tools, are they going to actually care about whether they can draw anything or not? And is that the end of the world? Maybe that's not the end of the world. Maybe so what? Now we've got this new technology and it's going to do all the drawing we needed. And yeah, we don't need drawers or illustrators, artists anymore, because we just have these computers to do it. And obviously some people are still going to become illustrators or artists or whatever, but I think maybe fewer. And I think it's going to be less likely that a child growing up is going to think that this might be a handy, fun thing to do when they have this other research that does it so much better than they can. Because I'll tell you right now, when I was 4 years old, I did not draw very well. So for a 4-year-old or a 5-year-old or a 6-year-old learning to draw, when they can just like tell the computer to make me a train locomotive with steam, blah, 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 and it'll do that in seconds, that sort of discourages that other impetus, that the notion that this kid's going to do that himself, I would fear.
I don't know. I think I can counter that a little bit just with my own experience, like I definitely, drew with crayons or whatever growing up, but I was way more interested in things like a spirograph, or, when I had first had access to a computer, I was super excited about like KidPix, which had stamping and kind of like drawing, but it was augmented with other things in the space. And I basically, when I saw that and had that, I didn't draw. I was printing things out. I was making things on the computer, trying to learn how to code. And so it was a very different kind of like engagement with the materiality of things. And I think it's a question of, what do we kind of classify as that type of creative expression? And it's a change in, maybe it's a perspective shift, right? Of where things are, and maybe it's like an expansion of what is encapsulated in terms of our understanding of creative practice at large. I think there's space for it, like I think like what Jonathan was saying before, with some of the folks that he's seen making work in these spaces, that like there's space for it all. And I definitely think I can imagine a kid being really excited about working with writing prompts and making things and doing other stuff in AI, and it being like a totally valid way to engage with a creative and artistic practice. And yeah, maybe they're not a drawer. I don't know. I think that's okay. I don't think everybody necessarily needs to be a drawer. Although I will say, I do think drawing and observation are a really fundamental skill, because you do learn a lot about the world through the process of moving it through your body. It's really important. But
Jonathan.
Making me think of some ideas about skill that come up a lot when people talk about automation, whether de-skilling, so if things get automated and we lose the opportunity to practice, the skill sort of goes away, but also about opportunities for developing new skills or for sort of incorporating them. And it's tough, right? Because it's often hard to guess what gets displaced when people start doing something. Like, this has nothing to do with AI, but coming from friendship research, when people started interacting on social media, everybody's like, oh, they're going to lose all their face-to-face communication skills. And it turns out the people who spend the most time interacting online also spend the most time interacting in person, and most of the time displacement comes from TV watching. So like, people are weird and complicated. But it does seem like, and I'm not an arts instructor, so I defer to folks who actually do that. But at least some of my colleagues seem really excited about using them to, not necessarily for end products, but for like mock-ups or sort of drafting and redrafting. And maybe that does become a part of some folks' artistic practices, but we also might need to be willing to run the experiment. And as Kathy's been pointing out, it's an experiment that, puts us in partnership, at least right now, with some entities we know are not necessarily going to be working in our best interest. So it's even more complicated.
Yeah.
Jonathan.
I guess I just am thinking about space. It seems to me for like every person who can draw that's born, there's probably somebody, who collects art being born somewhere in the world. And in my career, I've seen, you go to school, you learn how to draw a still life really well. You get out into the world, you want to make it stylized. You're young at that point, maybe. By the time you're 40, the crappier your drawing is, the more it sells for. It's an interesting world, and then by the time, you're 70 and they're doing a, life documentary on you, your paintings are totally just, fields of color and scribbles and whatever, and they're genius. So to say what, like makes good art and what isn't good art, I think in the long run is, it's based on the viewer. But I do admire somebody who hones their skill, before venturing off into those modern art kind of images, whatever that skill is. I remember seeing an interview with Jean-Michel Basquiat, and they were asking him all these questions about his images, and the first thing he said was, "I can draw, This is just what people buy." So who knows? I've taken illustration projects where I tried to draw things like really real life. And that was deemed a little stiff, you know? And then I went in and just made some funky looking characters, and that is what really warmed people's hearts. So that's just the visual, you know, side of AI. I have multiple Alexa devices. I use my phone constantly. I have a theory that half the people in traffic are actually AI, but you know, let's not talk about traffic. So yeah, it's an interesting topic, I'll say. I feel like a student right now. I feel like it's brand new. You know, it's like something that just showed up. And of course, my first reaction was to be like, oh, shoot. What the heck is this? And then I educated myself a little bit on it and the history of technology, you know, coming into our world. And I was like, well, the human spirit is, you know, programmed to fear the unknown. And I think as long as we use this tool for good and an ethical way, and hopefully someday, you know, with the power companies in a clean way, you know, if the power companies get their shit together, we won't have to worry about that. You know, we can all advance because obviously in the human race, if there's money to be made, people are going to make it. AI is here, you know, so I guess I might use it someday. I thought it would be pretty cool to just do like concept drawings or something like that, you know, and see what happened. But I don't know. Right now, I don't have a lot of time for that.
We are definitely in this era. I don't know if it's an era or a movement or period of a word that has been on my mind since 2020. And it's really about dismantling. And with the onslaught of AI, whether it be writing or art, you know, I feel like the number one thing it does is really challenge our assumptions about how things work. And then the next thing that stands out for me is as I work on a prompt or play around with image concepts, it really, I find that it forces me to seriously think about my reality, because I have to think critically about what's being produced. And then it does make me think about, so what is my outcome here? Because I feel like at times I'm just kind of floating through it and not really grounded in purpose. And that's an unusual space for me to be in, is to not have purpose. There's always some kind of purpose to what I'm doing. And so then I think a lot about like, what are the outcomes? What is the outcome of this? What is the outcome that I want? And all of that coming together for me leads me to think about the things that are really destructive about it, because you have your corporate influences in there and commodity. I mean, I sometimes feel like, you know, people are being made into a commodity yet again. And then the whole intersection of colonization and who is going to be colonized now again, or for the first time, you know? So it's so dynamic for me, and it causes me to pause and really think about the idea of dismantling. What is dismantling? What could be dismantling? And really, what do I want from that as a citizen of this world? It's fascinating and intriguing to me. And I don't think it's going to go away. And to Jonathan's point, supporting what Kathy and Alexis are really touching on here is, hopefully there's a way that we can do this that isn't going to be so disruptive to our climate. Hopefully we can figure that out. I mean, if we can figure out AI, I think we could figure out some way to have less impact on where we live. And, you know, I can't help but think, Ben, about the work you're doing with the Lost 40. And you mentioned something in an earlier conversation, not here, about the data that exists among those trees. And, you know, when we think about humanity and what is that, you know, we leave out a lot of the spiritual beings that, Jonathan, you're talking about. You know, there's a worldview that there's a spirit in plants and a spirit in the trees, and all of that has data. And so then I start thinking about, is AI really anything new? We have data all over, and we have harvested that data in many ways. And as an Anishinaabe person, I think about how that data was harvested for use in many, you know, for clothing, food, medicines. And we had to learn over time about sustainability to protect that resource. And will AI become yet another resource that we look back on and say, wow, we really had to learn about how to be sustainable about it? Kathy.
Well, I just like what you're saying about, it's so beautiful, right? It's like there's like data is a beautiful, can be a data is a beautiful thing. It's like, it is photosynthetic, it is tactile, it is spiritual, it is food. It's like, but a lot of that data doesn't exist in the input set for the large language model. And remember, like the large language models, all they're doing is they're averaging. So if you ask the large language model that's been averaging Reddit, averaging Substack, averaging what you see on the net, is that conversation. And you said, well, make me a sitcom that normal people find funny. What is it going to be? You know, it's like this, it's this hyper path to normal. You know, we've had a critique, we've dismantled, we've had a critical way of thinking about that term, right? But these are just normal, they're normalizing machines. That's what they do. And they do it very fast and they do it very effectively. And sometimes they're just way off because they're hyper local. And so they don't apply. So I only like, you know, like Ben, it's like you is looking, it's so moving, looking at the picture, learning what it means to be a tree is that process. But then like Ben would never say, well, now I'm going to apply it to, you know, something just completely outside of that locality, right? But that's exactly what the large companies are doing. They're saying, this is the data set that we've sucked in and we've made this model. We don't know how it works, exactly how it's drawn its conclusion. Now we're going to expand it to the world and make a decision about loaning money or about, you know, so it's like this, it's like at once this huge averaging agent, and also it's like hyper local and off when it tries to say something about, yeah, Anishinaabe culture in northern Minnesota. It's like, so it doesn't, so anyway, so I feel like that's the, you know, it's hard to be optimistic about that tool and about that process and about that intent and about that profitability and about that outcome. And so, you know, it's hard to just say, well, if we just tweak it a bit, right? Like I feel like there's something about this, that word is beautiful, dismantle. The master's tools will never dismantle the master's house. Audre Lorde, right? It's like that word, maybe that word is what we should be doing. So we shouldn't be adding in and tweaking. Maybe we should be dismantling and using a mimeograph machine. You know what I mean? Like, and writing down as fast as we can languages that are about to go live. I mean, like, I just feel like, is there something, you know, we don't have to become good, you know, partners that with a critical lens, we can actually say, that's fucked. It's like capitalism, right? We can say, well, we're going to tweak capitalism. My company is actually really likes to provide some, you know, like some benefit for poor people or something. Meanwhile, I'm in this capital lens. It's like, just dismantle, or the rich people will give some things for the poor people. But it's like, no, dismantle capitalism. Maybe the answer is something fundamental and structural, that, it's not about aesthetics, it's about something that's something deeper.
Thank you for that, Kathy. You always bring me back around. I find my way back with you. And all of these pieces of it are so important, and understanding the impact that it has. And I feel we're at a point in our existence as people that we have a lot of knowledge, and we can access a lot of knowledge, and we can use that to hopefully be a part of figuring out what we want with this.
This does make me think of a couple of discussions on data sovereignty at the community level and what that might look like. A lot of interesting and valuable work going on there, including who owns the languages. There have been a couple of really interesting and, to my mind, productive fights to keep data in the hands of communities that have historically had an investment in them, rather than selling it off to companies that'll then sell it back. But also data justice. And there's been a couple of nice books out on that recently about how, if we all have access to some of these models that are already being used by corporations, we can sort of see what's going on under the hood and think about how to use that creatively. Maybe it's not the end of the story, but I always show my students when we're talking about policing and sort of like heat maps of crime-rich neighborhoods, and it always lights up poor neighborhoods. If you make a heat map for financial crimes, the wealthy districts light up. So like we can think about the ways that the biases inherent in the data can be usefully made visible, as well as part of that process. And I think there's some really interesting and good work going on there.
Well, I thank Kathy and Alexis for those thoughts, and I'm going to open the floor up to Rick and Ben and Jonathan for any final thoughts before we end our panel discussion.
Well, hard to say where this is all going to go. It's going to be interesting. I'll say that much. Yeah, I don't have too much to say. It's an interesting time to be an illustrator. I'll say that much.
Thank you, Rick. Ben, Jonathan?
Yeah, I don't have too much more to add. I just want to thank everybody for a great conversation, and really appreciate all the different perspectives and voices, and yeah, thanks so much.
I guess I just want to, there was a couple of questions, one of them from CPL Imaging. Kelly, how would the artists on this panel feel about someone being able to request an AI image in the Jonathan Thunder style, for instance? I think that'd be pretty cool to see, like imitation is the best form of flattery. I would imagine whoever's asking for that probably couldn't afford an image directly from me anyway, so good luck to them. And I don't know, maybe after the panel I'll go and try that myself and see if anything comes up. I kind of think I'm not well known enough to actually have anything solid come through, but it's an interesting thought, like if you look at my work, if I were an AI art generator, I could say that I've ripped off multiple artists, that I've studied in my life. I incorporate Disney imagery, Warner Brothers, pop culture stuff. One year I was trying to study copyright laws because I was afraid that McDonald's might sue me. So, it's a deep rabbit hole, and this is a good conversation. So thank you all.
So we kind of opened up with that, Jonathan, about how we pull together everything that has influenced us and sort of stir it up and move it around and then create. And the room that there is for that type of art, for the generation of that art. So. Well, thank you, everybody. I want to thank our sponsors again, and all of our panelists with their expertise and their points of view. This has been really rich and robust, and I'm grateful that we're able to give this to our art community. We will be keeping this posted on our YouTube page so folks can access it. And again, this was really wonderful. Thank you so much. Thank you, Miigwech, for being here and doing this panel discussion with the Duluth Art Institute.
Okay.
Thank you.
Thanks, everybody.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Thanks, you guys.